guys, welcome to my channel. My name is ReadingBear and I hope you are ready for some more stories. And today, we'll take a look at some new entitled people content. If you enjoyed my content, please don't forget to subscribe to my channel and post some bear emojis in the comment. And now, let's dive right into the stories.
The first story is entitled Neighbor Digs Up Part of My Family's Yard and Damages Our Driveway with Heavy Landscaping Equipment. Later puts a dog fence along our entire property border and tries to claim an easement. Before I begin, this all happened when I was around 13 or 14, so some of the details have been provided by my parents. I'm posting this now because I was reminded about it. Entitled Neighbor will be abbreviated as N and my mother will be M. The story begins with N having a couple of trees on the border of my family's property that he wanted taken down. This was kind of odd, as these trees had been there since long before he moved in and were in no way damaged or diseased, but hey, it's his property and who am I to judge? Anyway, in the process of talking to M about it across yards, I was present for this conversation. He casually dropped that he would need to have some heavy equipment in to take down the trees, to which M basically said, that's alright, why do you mention it? N responded something along the lines of, well, it would need to go through your property to get to the trees. The way he said it was kind of condescending, as if it was obvious somehow. M objected to this, since N's yard was by all means capable of accommodating the machinery in question without causing harm to their property. N got in quite the huff about this, saying something to the effect of, well, I don't want it going through my property, and besides, you have a driveway they can use. Faced with the fact that N was clearly not going to back down on this right now, M ended the conversation and thought nothing of it. Keep in mind, my family isn't that well off, and our driveway hadn't been repaved in years. Thus, it was showing signs of wear like cracks and ruts. This meant that a bunch of heavy landscaping equipment going back and forth over it would almost certainly make that worse. Fast forward a few months later. My family goes on a trip, I'm not exactly sure where. I think it was to see family in the next state over. We come back and our yard is a mess. N had gotten the landscapers out while we were gone and lied to them, saying that my family had given permission to use our yard and driveway. Several bushes and small trees in our yard were completely torn up, along with several fruit bushes M had been working for years to neatly cultivate. Oh, and there was also a giant hole in our backyard. This would end up collecting stormwater from our neighbor's property into ours, where it would become stagnant and host an insane amount of mosquitoes in warmer months. I won't get into it now, but this is a whole other story of entitlement and would almost result in a civil case against N. Eventually we paid around $800 to have it filled in. He was a lawyer and promised to financially drain us if we sued. Of course, we were furious that this posse had the audacity to lie to the landscapers and completely wreck one side of our yard and driveway. I can distinctly remember a phone conversation on speaker with M about to lose it at N. She was saying how this was going to potentially cost the family thousands to fix it, in fact, did, and how N had to pay for lying about having our permission. He essentially just laughed it off and said something like it was entirely within my rights, and if you don't drop the issue now, I might try applying for an easement on that land. After all, I've been taking care of it, and I know the law. That last part is verbatim what he said, and I still recall it clear as day. This was obvious BS and M knew it, but again, he was very braggadocious about being a respected lawyer and they were intimidated by that. So, now down a couple thousand from driveway and yard repairs and under the threat of having their property taken from us, M didn't go any further with it. Thinking this was the end of it, we continued on with our lives and vowed not to say a single word to N. Fast forward again about a year and out of nowhere a dog fence is put in, again on my family's property. And then has his landscapers start taking care of the area on top of the dog fence as if it were his property. Knowing what was about to happen, M decided she'd had enough and talked to N again. And basically said that property is now basically mine and I'm getting an easement to make it official. M, being an architect and having experience with landscape design and property disputes, knew what she would have to do next. She brought out a surveyor to find the property markers and, sure enough, the dog fence was thoroughly in my family's yard. After more back and forth, N finally agreed to move the fence onto his side of the property, but not before threatening an easement claim again. I'd like to say that he got some sort of comeuppance for what he did, but unfortunately, he got off completely free. My family is in a better position now financially, but we're far past the statute of limitations for filing a case. The next story is entitled Neighbor Would Rather Call the Cops Than Close Her Window. Well, I've finally worked up the motivation to commit this nugget of my past to the open range of the internet. It's had a good life being brought out by spoken word alone, but it's time to let it run wild. Also, the bigger factor is there is no way the other party involved can find me, nor can they harass my family. When I was young, about 8 or 9 I believe, my 7-person household moved into a bigger house. This larger, if not particularly well upkept, house had a large, not well upkept, backyard on a lake. We also now had 2 types of neighbors. The first is the typical type, one you share a street with. However, we were at the end of a cul-de-sac, so the second type of neighbors, the lake neighbors, were people on entirely different streets that shared property lines with us regardless. Most of our neighbors were lovely. My best friend during those years was a lake neighbor a few houses down. We were not as lucky when it came to our lake neighbor to the direct left of us lake-wise. As mentioned, the place needed a bit of work when we moved in, like working electricity and getting rid of the pests that had led to the destruction of wires. By the time I'm writing this, almost every room has been improved with major renovations, one at a time. Before even things like a good kitchen though, my dad was clearing up the lakefront area of the backyard. He wanted his 5 kids to have wonderful summers on the lake, and we'd moved just in time. We bought a canoe, put down sand for a baby beach, brought lawn chairs and some anchored inflatable rafts. But the best feature was the fire pit, and our s'more-loving tastes could not wait to indulge in what was usually reserved for the occasional camping trip. A few more details to establish the setting before I continue. My backyard was long, not wide. To get from the house to the lake one must trek down a hill and path my dad laid out with wood chips through many trees and below a larger hill on the left. The same side as the stars of this story. This is important. What's also important is this fire pit had been built by the previous owners of our property when they themselves had children, but that was several decades ago. It, like the rest of the lakefront, had not been used in decades. In fact, before we moved in, we're pretty sure the lake neighbors had never seen it in use. Now of course when we moved in my dad got to work. When he cleaned up the pit, he did not move it or alter it in size at all. What he did do was replace its loose brick border with a proper metal grate and remove any grass from about a foot from the grate just in case. It was cleared of weeds, loaded up with fresh wood, and surrounded by lawn chairs for 5 hungry s'more-craving children. One wonderful summer evening it was finally time to break in the new fire pit. We lit the fire and settled back to wait for the fire to reach the perfect size for marshmallows. We'd opened the door to pandemonium with this action as it turned out. Now we'd had encounters with our left lake neighbor before, who I'm gonna call Linda for now. She'd occasionally walk down the steep stairs that let her house access the lake far below. Her house was on the important hill, and talk with our parents on days we were playing on the lake. I found out much later the content of those conversations was usually, "Can you tell your kids to play quieter? Your street may be more active, but ours is a quiet street." My parents usually expressed sympathy for her house being right next to a busy lake that often had people water skiing, tubing, and playing music far louder than children can play, and this just repeated a few times until my parents stopped supervising us on the lake. Neighbor never wanted to talk to us kids. On the night we used the fire pit for the first time, I finally heard Linda's voice for the first time. It was a very loud, "What the hell do you think you're doing?" My parents immediately walked over to the fence to engage, but I could hear pretty well what she was screaming. What set her off was as we were sitting and enjoying our lovely fire pit, the smoke rose up important steep hill and came in her windows. An unforgivable crime for sure. And according to her, one that could only be taken care of by us dousing our fire and never using the fire pit again, lest she be forced to call the cops. My parents dismissed her, telling her to close her window if the smoke really was able to reach it. We happily went back to marshmallow toasting as she stormed off, thinking she wouldn't make good on her threat, because what law could we even have broken? If you read the title, you know better than tiny child me. It wasn't an empty threat. I had gone up to the house with a sister for more bug spray when I saw men knocking on our front door. I peeped through the glass, spotted the cops sent to us, and sent little sister to fetch parents while I answered the door asking them to wait until my mom came up to the house. The police were understanding about it. I don't think they wanted to talk to a 9-year-old either. In the end, after gaining permission from my mom, They viewed the fire pit and judged everything in order. It was a safe and clean setup, and told Linda that we weren't doing anything wrong. Maybe she should just close her window. She didn't like that advice, but my parents asked the police to please reason with her somewhere else like Linda's driveway. We had an evening to enjoy. This repeated a good handful of times. We would have a fire on a lovely night. Linda would scream and then call the cops. Sometimes she'd switch it up and call the cops before screaming. We even had official people show up to judge that our pit didn't break any laws about where it could be in regard to distance from shore, buildings, trees, etc. I don't know all the legalese. The cops did tell her to stop calling them on us, but we'd usually have a team visit us once a year regardless for a while. She got bored of screaming at us too. We were just told I'm calling the cops over the fence, and she'd trudge back up without another word. Perhaps she stopped because we asked about the huge bonfire her kids had on the important hill one Halloween night that everyone on 4 streets could see and at least one person called the cops about. It was terrifyingly large. There isn't an exciting end to this story except for the last time I know of her yelling at us. Over time as we grew up, I'm now moved out and Linda is long gone apparently, we used the fire pit less and less. However, there was one thing we ended up needing it for, and that was for animal disposal. Now we were no strangers to deer in our backyard, but we've also had some dead ones decide to stay, one 16-point buck due to Linda's fence. My dad wouldn't let us keep the head. One of them we discovered frozen to the ground during winter, and we were tired of paying people to deal with it, so the following March my dad sectioned it and chose a few of my sisters to help him burn it in the lovely fire pit. I suppose part of the reason Linda had stopped bothering us over the years was that she'd learned to close her window in the summer, but as it was March, maybe it was open. Either way, she noticed what the deer disposal team was up to, stormed down the stairs, and once again, screams out, "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Youngest sister had never witnessed Linda in her prime in person. Youngest sister just wanted to be a good neighbor and provide information. Youngest sister therefore didn't realize why maybe she shouldn't yell back to Linda. Nor did she realize maybe she shouldn't tell Linda the truth. So youngest sister, before my dad can calmly talk to Linda, yells back just as loud, "Hello. We're burning a deer." While Linda was left shocked and trying to form a response, my dad walked to her, stated, "Hello Linda. We're burning a deer." He then doused the fire and went to the house to await the cops, tasking the deer cremation team with watching the remaining parts for scavengers. While he waited for the cops, he regaled me with this section of the story, mimicking Linda and my sister's voices pretty well, I might add. When the cops eventually arrived, my dad was prepared with, "It's illegal to leave dead animals on your property, right? We're not burning anything bigger than the fire pit." Technically true. He wouldn't tell me what else he said to them, but either way the cops were informed she had a history of calling the cops on us and had been told to stop that, so they promptly went over to talk with her instead, never even going down to see our cremation set up. Guess she called wolf too many times in the end. The last story is titled, "But I'm a doctor. I have a right to your driveway." This is not my story, but my dad's. This happened over 15 years ago, when my dad had a house in San Francisco, on Potrero Hill, which was 3 blocks away from a large hospital called General Hospital. This will be important. One morning Dad came home from work. He worked the swing shift as a bus mechanic, and found a car in his driveway. Someone asshat had parked their shiny new Mercedes in my dad's driveway, which had a big sign clearly stating "No parking. Private property." Dad had to park on the street instead of in his garage, which pissed him off. The neighborhood had been plagued with car break-ins and thefts in the last few months, and Dad had the door window in his SUV smashed twice. So, Dad left a note asking them to not park in his driveway. Next day, same Mercedes is in the driveway again. So, Dad left a second, longer note, telling them to stop ducking parking in my driveway or I'll call the cops and have your ass ticketed, and if you do it again, have your car towed. You'd think the asshat would get a clue. But if he had, this wouldn't be on here. Next day, the car was there yet again. So, true to his word, Dad called the cops and the car got ticketed. The following morning, Dad came home to find his driveway vacant, no Mercedes in sight. Dad was relieved he'd gotten his driveway and his garage back. This isn't the end of it, naturally. That afternoon, around 4 p.m., my dad's friend, who was sitting out on Dad's front steps, working on a car part, looked up from what he was doing to see the same Mercedes pull up in front of the house. A short, 30-something, Middle Eastern guy in a very nice suit, gets out and starts angrily stomping up my dad's stairs. He stopped on the first landing, below my dad's friend, and demands to know if he's the homeowner. Dad's friend says no and turns to yell for my dad, but Dad, after hearing raised voices, comes out to investigate. Immediately, this guy, in a very heavy accent, demands to know why my dad had called the cops on him and got him ticketed. He is waving said ticket around like a pim-pom as he yells. My dad calmly tells him that since it's his driveway and this guy had been parking there, day after day, illegally, despite being told not to, he had every right to call the cops when someone trespasses on his private property. On hearing this guy proceeds to totally lose his crap. He, according to my dad, turns red in the face and, I kid you not, yells, "I'm a doctor. I can park wherever I want to. Everywhere else is taken and I'm not paying to park in the ducking lot. And it's not like you're even using it anyway." Turned out asshat worked at the hospital, probably in the proctology department, and figured, since he was a doctor, he had a right to park in my dad's driveway. He even claimed the sticker on his car proved he could park anywhere, anytime, with impunity. And my dad was using his garage, which this asshat's Mercedes was blocking. He went on to tell my dad that he needed to pay for this entitled shithead's ticket. Ticket was only $85. My dad and his friend both laughed, and Dad told him he could shove that idea, and the ticket, up his own ass, and as a doctor, Dad told him, he was sure known how to find it. Dad also told him that if he ever saw that Mercedes in his driveway again, he'd have it towed. My dad said the guy's face turned even redder, as in chili pepper red, and he almost expected to see steam coming out of his ears. He then began cussing my dad out and threatened to sue, but my dad cut him off, telling him if he didn't get off his property, he'd happily throw him down the stairs. There were 45 steps, and this a hole was on the 27th. Dad's friend, who's a big guy and ex-military and looks it, smiled evilly. Mr. I'm a doctor, realizing he wasn't gonna get his way, turned and stomped down the steps like a pissed-off 7-year-old, switching between threatening litigation and cussing my dad out, but only after he'd gotten out of range of my dad and his friend. The doctor never sued, and Dad never saw him, or his Mercedes, again. Thanks for listening.